Are you passionate about shaping India's future? Keen to find solutions for India's most pressing challenges? Look no further than Takshashila's postgraduate program in public policy. This 48-weekend program will equip you with the knowledge, skills, and network needed to pivot to a meaningful career in public policy. Apply in the link below by June 1st. The program begins June 20th. Hope to see you there.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
So finally, it happened. A US president visited Beijing after a gap of nearly 9 years. And it was the first trip by Trump in his second stint at the White House. And understandably, there was a lot of hype, there was a lot of expectations built around this trip. But did anything substantial come out of it? Or did any breakthrough happen? The signs are not so strong. To discuss the takeaways, the highlights, and what this trip means for China and the world, I have with me Amit Kumar, who is a China researcher with the Takshashila Institution, and I'm Lokendra Sharma, your host for this episode. So, Amit, let's jump right into it, and let me ask you: did you feel that this trip live up to its hype with a star-studded business delegation was part of it, and even US media made a lot of noise around this trip, even global media for that matter. So what were the key highlights and takeaways for you, and did it live up to the hype? That's the first question for you.
Thanks, Lokendra, so much for having me on this episode. Glad to be talking about this very much anticipated meeting. To answer your question, it's important to set the context of the meeting and the significance of the meeting. Correct, right? And depending upon how and what expectations you had from the summit before the summit happened, the answer, I think, would vary for your question, whether it lived up to the hype or not. Well, yes, the meeting was much anticipated and even got postponed because of the Iran war. But also, even before the Iran war, things were not quite conducive for this sort of leaders level meeting to happen, right? Because of the tariff frenzy, which was first initiated by Trump and then China counterattacked, right? Trump, as soon as he came to power, he sanctioned and imposed certain sanctions on China's imports. And then finally, on Liberation Day, 1st of April, there was a whole blanket sanctions that were introduced across the board, not just against the Chinese, but across all major trading or trading partners that the US has. So, and then while other countries complied with it and did not react, China did. And therefore, it quickly snowballed into a major tariff war. Each sanctioned the entire trade basket of the other country. And then the question was, we were all wondering who would blink first. And because soon it was clear that both had started feeling the pain of sanctioning each other, there was some understanding that was building within both the decision-making apparatus of the two countries, but primarily in the US, that something needs to be done. And then it took about a series of meetings, first in Geneva, then in London, and then finally in Busan last year, in December 2025, to achieve some sort of a breakthrough. And despite the two countries making some concessions in Geneva and then in London, both accused each other of flouting the agreements and breaching the understanding that was reached, and accusing each other of withdrawing from the agreement or the understanding. So, coming on to your question, this meeting came in the backdrop of these events and therefore the hype. And anyway, when leaders of the world's two most powerful countries meet, there will always be some form of hype and expectations. And as you said, this was the first time that the US president was visiting China after almost a decade since his last visit in 2017. Of course, they use their, the expectations that was there was high. But if you ask me, personally, it was, and this is coming back to the question that I raised earlier, depending upon what the expectations were, the answers would vary. But if you ask me, it was unlikely to get anything. Either country was unlikely to get anything significant out of this meeting, and two reasons primarily for me, which informs me. One, the structural problem underneath these pleasantries and Trump's niceties. The two countries continue to be strategic rivals, and this was aptly captured in Xi's statement. He referred to the Thucydides trap to define the relationship between the two countries, and even warned the US, but also accepted that there'll be competition. But the warning was that this has to be managed better. And second, I would say we did not see anything significant coming out of this meeting, was because, in my opinion, most of the stumbling blocks or the sticking points where the two could have cooperated ideally, not the two sticking points where the two do not see each other eye to eye, but those issues where the two could have cooperated ideally, they had been already done during the Busan meeting, when each relaxed several trade restrictions or export controls against each other. And those were the ones which were actually, creating a form of pain for each other, right? So the both gave each other some concessions. So the goal of the meeting in that sense was just a reflection of that there's some sort of stability that had been reached, and the time was just conducive for even a symbolic meeting. Even if it's just for the sake of symbolism, this meeting should happen, because at times, even symbolism can drive some sort of outcomes, and or at least induce some sort of cooling off effect on the larger bilateral relationship. This is not to say that it did or it has happened so far, but in that sense, I wasn't expecting anything significant coming out of this meeting, and I don't think there's anything big that came out of the meeting. So, as we say at Takshashila, expectation setting is necessary. So, depending upon how you set the expectations, you would define whether this lived up to the hype or not. Now, finally, coming on to your final part of the question, key takeaways from the meeting. So, let's talk about what the two sides wanted from each other, right? To be very precise, I think Trump's visit seemed more like a business trip to China. Now, the sheer size of the business delegation that accompanied Trump and the conversations that were initiated by the US tells us that this was mostly a business trip, and the priority was greater market access for American businesses in China. So, on that front, again, there were some commitments that the Chinese made and the Americans secured on greater agricultural purchase, buying about 200 Boeing aircraft. And if I understand and the Chinese correctly, and even if you go by what has happened so far since 2018, I would say, I am very skeptic of these commitments. These are just oral commitments that have been made. I don't see Chinese following through.
On this commitments, maybe quickly I can pitch in here.
Yeah.
No, I agree with your sense, because I think with Trump, there's a playbook to deal with Trump. If you can give him some headline numbers to pacify him, I'm maybe not necessarily follow it through, right? I think Apple did this well in Trump's first term and even now. And then European Union has promised some big numbers. China has promised some numbers, but there are hardly any details about it. And I think Chinese side is not saying something concrete about it either to confirm it. So it seems like well out of a playbook to manage Trump that way. Do you agree with that?
I mean, yes, this is one of the ways to deal with Trump, but I don't know. The Chinese are even serious with the commitment in the sense that, they made certain commitments even during Trump 1.0 in 2018, and they fell well short of breaching. By about 40% of what they had committed, they had not bought. This is on both agriculture and soybean purchases and other purchases that they had committed, and that they would increase their imports from the US, right? But they hadn't done so. So if you look, and then there is obviously a conscious decision within the Chinese leadership that they, because of how the two countries have seen each other and have been battling each other, given the rivalry and the confrontation, it does not make sense for the Chinese to be dependent on the US for something like soybean for their food security, which is consumed in high numbers, high amount in China. So, and therefore they have very consciously diversified their imports from the US. Then another thing that the Americans wanted was given there was last minute how Jensen Huang was added to the delegation. They wanted the Chinese to start buying H200 chips, and Reuters also leaked the 10 entities that had received American US Commerce Department's approval to buy up to 75,000 NVIDIA chips, H200 chips. But then Lutting had informed the Congress in April that the Chinese are themselves not wanting to buy those chips. And the Americans wanted now to sell those chips, not in huge numbers, I would say, but still they wanted to make the Chinese to buy those chips, right? But the Chinese are now obstructing. There was an instruction issued by the Chinese leadership in January early this year that unless it's absolutely necessary, they do not want H200 chips to be bought by Chinese agents, right? So in terms of, I think, takeaways, I don't think there was any takeaway for the Trump administration. He came with a bunch of requests.
What about the fentanyl precursors thing? I think there's some.
Yeah. So the fentanyl, again, as you would know, that fentanyl has been a long-standing issue in U.S.-China relationship, and on multiple occasions, and even the first round of tariffs that were introduced by Trump as soon as he took power in January 2025 was imposed because of the fentanyl thing, right? And the smuggling and how it enters the US market, and the Chinese are not doing enough. And again, it's been a long-standing issues. Every time they meet, there's some assurances and requests, demands that are made by the Americans and reassurance with the Chinese, but it has not helped. I mean, some development has taken on that front, but still not enough to assuage the concerns of the Americans, right? So, I mean, I don't know if this will again pan out in something that is very satisfactory for the Trump administration. So let's see. These are assurances that have been repeated and given before as well. But each time you see there is a meeting between US leadership and the Chinese leadership, these demands or issues related to fentanyl are again raised, right? And nothing happens.
Thanks, Amit. I think that was a wonderful answer because it set the context for listeners and also provided a very layered and nuanced answer as to what the expectations, around the expectations and the takeaways both. So thanks for that. We'll move to the next bit. And I think, especially in media publications, this was played out repeatedly, especially in the US, as to the Taiwan question, right?
Yeah.
And the headline went like this, that she delivered a warning to Trump on Taiwan, and sort of warned that if Taiwan question is not handled properly, then there'll be conflicts and things like that. And Trump appeared to, on the other hand, play the Taiwan question as some sort of a negotiation chip. I didn't understand what he was trying to do fully on the Taiwan thing, and I understand that there is a it has to sign off a multi-billion-dollar arms sales to Taiwan, I think, which the Congress has approved. So it's with him right now. So maybe he's using that as a negotiation chip with China to some extent. So can you, for the clarity of me and also for the listeners, disentangle what exactly is this? What unfolded vis-a-vis the Taiwan question in China?
See, it's simple. So Taiwan is one of the red lines that the Chinese have outlined to the Americans, and that's the biggest sticking point, the biggest concern or issue, according to the Chinese, in the larger US-China relationship, that the US's support to the Taiwanese, as they call secessionist tendencies. And this is something which has deeply upset the balance or the bilateral relationship, right? And therefore, and every time you would see that there's a meeting, the US-China meeting, the Americans would always shy off from commenting on the Taiwan question when a US-China or big level meeting is happening, and the Chinese always, putting that upfront, that Taiwan is the biggest sticking issue in the US-China relationship, and it was the same this time as well. So the warning that the Chinese leadership or Xi Jinping issued was, if you do not manage this handle the Taiwan situation properly, it will lead to confrontation. And we do not want any confrontation. We accept the competition. We do not want the confrontation. And to each of the questions that Trump was asked relating to whether Taiwan was discussed or what did in response to Xi's question, because one of the question I think that is circulating in the media is Xi Jinping asking Donald Trump if US would intervene if there was some form of contingency in the Taiwan Strait. And Trump kept dodging that question and later clarified that the last thing that we want at this point of time is a war 9,500 miles away. Did not clearly answer if the US would intervene or what the plans were, but he did clarify later that he wants to use this, arms sales deal to Taiwan as a negotiating chip. Now, Trump has sanctioned more in terms of value if you see arms sales to Taiwan than in any other presidency, right? And even before, I think 2 arms sales packages have been sanctioned lately. But this one that you're talking about is the $14 billion arms sales to Taiwan. Now, how Trump sees this, at least from the looks of it, it seems like he sees this as a negotiating chip. So, as if he could pressure the Chinese to behave and get some concessions in return for not approving this $14 billion arms package to Taiwanese, right? And it has been, and he did say that it has been held up in some abeyance, and the approval is conditional on how the Chinese behave and they cooperate. Also, I think he linked it to China's cooperation in the Iran issue. So this is how Trump administration, or at least Trump, is looking at this deal. But this looks very in a very poor light when you see how Trump administration or under Trump US has been behaving with its allies and partners. Now Taiwan is this has triggered a sense of insecurity in Taiwan. And says that if this is how the world's 2 most powerful countries are managing, it also sends out a message to other middle powers in a sense that if Taiwan is some sort of an ally or ally-like entity for the Americans, and if this is how the Americans are going to negotiate with the principal adversary, which is China here in this case, is a principal adversary to both America and Taiwan. If this is how the Americans are going to behave, what message does this send to other middle powers, partners, or allies of the US? So this is a very troubling thing. Whether this will go, the package will go through and will receive approval. I mean, I can't speculate. It could be, it could be not. For now, it seems like it will be delayed because some form of stability in the US-China relations is necessary. But it could very well be the situation where you could finally see the arm package going through. So that's my take on this issue.
Thanks, Amit, for explaining this slightly convoluted issue in a very simple manner. And in your response, you also touched on the Iran question. I think very briefly you mentioned it in passing. So maybe my next question can be on that. And we all understand that China buys a lot of Iranian oil. I think partly Iranian economy is afloat because of China transacting with it. And we also understand that at least with satellite intelligence, if not more, China is assisting Iran in the ongoing war in West Asia. So, and I think this Iran question also came up during the trip in China. And do you see, or do you have any reasons to believe that Trump's trip would have any bearing, or whether he has struck any understanding with Xi, and that would have any bearing on how this war in West Asia goes forward, or how it concludes?
See, simple answer, I don't think so. Basically, because there's a difference in perception in as to what is fueling the war or tensions in West Asia. So, did mention that we need. The both sides agreed on that the Strait of Hormuz should be open for. They should be accessible. Trade should start. Trade and traffic should start flowing from the Strait of Hormuz. There should be no blockade. There should be some form of stability in West Asia, and they both, kind of express the desire that some form of stability should return, and the war should end, and we should get on with the with normal lives, right? But there's a difference in perception in how the two countries view, especially relating to the factors that are fueling this problem. The Chinese said, yes, of course, we also want the war to end. We don't want Iran to go nuclear. We want the Strait of Hormuz to be opened up. But the problem to address here is that the US should, withdraw and stop its operations in West Asia, whatsoever. So it's the US actions in the West Asia that is resulting in these problems. On the Americans, how they view it, and I mean, I would say wrongly so, is because the Chinese are aiding. I mean, yes, there's truth in that the fact that the Chinese are aiding Iranian capabilities, but and their perception is if this that sort of aid and help stops, uh, maybe Iran will come to the negotiating table and will accept the position that the Americans want. And it's the Chinese help that is bolstering their ambitions and their resolve. So there's a difference in perception in how the two sides view the factors that are actually fueling the conflict in or the war in West Asia. And because there's no agreement over the factors, because they both have differing perceptions, I don't think there was any substantive agreement on how to bring this to a halt, how to bring the war in West Asia to a halt. So I don't think even on that front there was any major deliverable that we saw, simply because the two sides have differing positions in relating to what is actually fueling the conflict in West Asia.
Thanks, Amit. I think in your response, you mentioned this word perception multiple times.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll talk about perceptions next. And again, going by media coverage for this trip, which was quite extensive, it felt as if some Western publications were subtly suggesting how she appeared more resolute and how China emerged more stronger from a perception point of view. And this was in contrast to the negotiating style or the speaking style or the way Trump approached some of these interactions. So do you agree with this assessment? Do you think would China would be seen as a near peer or a peer of US in terms of just perception going forward?
See, I would say this reading isn't without any substance. There's a stark contrast, if you see, between Trump's approach to China when he took over in January 2025 and even during his presidential campaign. But that, again, we can understand there's a need. You need to be more assertive. I mean, politicians tend to be more assertive during presidential campaigns, but things change when you actually assume office. But even then, there's a stark contrast between how Trump approached China and behaved with respect to China when he took over in January 2025 and in the last, I would say, 5-6 months. You just need to look at the hawkish statement that Trump was constantly using against China and how he'll bring China on its knees within no time. Right? Remember during his presidential campaign that he'll slap this much tariff and he'll make China buy more, remove problems with respect to market access, etc. And this overconfidence actually pushed them to try an arm twist China after he took office. First, very quickly after assuming office, he slapped 20% tariffs and then increased that after the Liberation Day tariffs. And then it snowballed, as we discussed earlier, leading to each country sanctioning the entire gamut of trade basket, right? But it clearly didn't work out. And the worst thing was that he didn't choose to differentiate among his allies, partners, and adversaries. Now, but that's a question for a different episode, I think. But the Western media the Western media and the publications, they have inferred that this is a very stark position, that the position that the Trump administration is taking now with respect to China is very different from the one that it took. And some have even referred to it as Trump being in deal-making mode. I think it was a foreign policy piece that referred to Trump's actions as some sort of a deal-making mode. And this is largely because a lot of troubles back home. Trump promised a lot of things. It did not pan out that way. Inflation is quite a concern. And there's midterm elections that are approaching, right? So he needs something substantive to show to his domestic audience. There are domestic vulnerabilities and problems, economic problems, and he needs something to show to his voters and constituency that he got some concessions, the trip was successful, so that he can have a favorable result in the midterm elections. And therefore, this visit, Trump's visit to China, seemed more like a business trip. Uh, Strategic priorities were not, I would say, they were not at the top of the agenda. Business agenda were at the top. They dominated the agenda for at least for the Americans. Now, if you look at the Chinese, it felt like the Americans, or under Trump's leadership, went with certain set of demands. I would rather say not demands. I would rather say requests. But the Chinese instead used the summit to express, or use the meeting to warn and caution the Americans that it is particularly your responsibility to induce stability in the relations. I think they used four types of stability: healthy stability, lasting stability, and things like that. So four forms of stability.
I think, Amit, there was this phrase also, constructive
Yes.
strategic stability, something.
Yes. And that had about four components of stability that they talked about. So it's what it told us, that the Chinese have accepted that there will be problems, confrontation, and there will be rivalry. But it is up to, the onus is on Trump to manage this better. And he has to be a better leader and has to control his, inefficacies in the domestic setup. And he has to really take charge of the issues in US-China relations. And he has to do that. So largely, the Chinese use this meeting to caution and warn the Americans that it is your responsibility, one, that the US-China relations do not suffer much, and there is some form of stability in the US-China relations. The onus is on you. And second, it took the opportunity to warn the Americans on the Taiwan issue, that if you do not manage it well, this will certainly lead into conflict, which you do not want. We do not want it either. But if you continue to behave in certain manner and continue to, you also approve this deal, the arms sales deal, package deal to the Taiwanese, this will lead to conflict, certainly, in some time in the future. So do not do that. So clearly there was a difference in how the two sides approached the meeting. The Americans went with a series of requests, market access, and that too they didn't get. On agricultural produce, I think I'm very skeptical that they'll get anything. 200 Boeings. That again competes with the Chinese, what the Chinese what the Chinese are developing at this point. And then the third was Nvidia chips. Even though now the Americans want to sell those chips, again there's still a cap, but the Chinese are not interested because they fear that that might, halt the self-sufficiency drive that is happening within the country. So they didn't get anything. Plus, they got lectured by the Chinese leadership on the larger US-China relationship and the Taiwan issue. So clearly, this perception was not without any substance.
So essentially, Amit, you're saying that there was some substance to, that powered, or gave
Yes.
some weight to this perception.
Yes. Trump was much more muted, and seems, it's quite apparent that he's much more muted in his statements and how he, she is my wonderful friend, wonderful country, etc., etc. Of course, he's been known to do that even when giving statements back in America. But yes, this is a very completely different Trump than you had seen in 2025, the first half of 2025, I would say.
Yeah, agreed. But I just wanted to make a very quick observation here, Amit. I think in this whole battle of perceptions, right, we should never lose sight on the hard power differential between both sides, which I think sustains till date. So that differential is definitely there. And also, one interesting thing that strikes me is China is, it's been about like 7-8 decades since the communists took power in mainland China. And about the same time, about the same many decades since, this mainland China and Taiwan issue has persisted. And China is still pushing for its red lines, or the idea that they want to someday reunify with Taiwan. Now imagine this: imagine United States as a country telling another country maybe across an ocean that you cannot play around with, let's say any particular state in West Indies or any particular state close to the shores of America, or even the mainland US, in Central America, so on and so forth. So uh, the fact that China is still saying it, right, that it is not able to still do anything about a question that is so close to its history, so close to how they have thought about their place in the world, and they're still, even if they're lecturing, they're still, in a way telling the US to not mess around with an island that is very close to their shores. I think says something about the power differential as well, because I don't think US is doing the same thing or has done the same thing, maybe except the Cuban question some decades ago during the height of the Cold War. What do you think about that, Amit?
See, I think that's correct. So there's a power differential, and then there's also a perception of the kind of power that each of the countries have, the image of itself that the two countries have of themselves, right? So US has been a power, a global power, a great power that has ventured into very far off, far away lands from the very beginning. And I think apart from the European countries, I mean, to this date, US remains the only country which has the wherewithal and the capacity and the willingness to intervene in faraway lands. It doesn't often or never fights conflict that is very near to its shores. And that capacity, I think, no other country at this point of time has, not even China. One, again, and plus, when it comes to the Taiwan question, so again, it has a long history, and there are a lot of other reasons why China may not be very comfortable in intervening in Taiwan and taking it forcefully. One, I think what I have observed is the appetite for the Chinese for any conflict which involves military action and can lead to higher casualties, loss of lives. The appetite is very less. And I think one episode that confirmed this was during Galwan, and then again at Yangtze, when again you had frictions between Indian soldiers. So the moment there was friction and loss of life in Galwan, the Chinese backed down from Galwan. So the appetite, I think, one question. They have no willingness to intervene in faraway lands in West Asia, or in, even though they had some form of partnerships with the Venezuelans, they did not want to be there. So the appetite for that kind of an intervention is lacking. So this is one thing China as a great power or an emerging rising power, revisionist power, lacks the appetite of that scale of the risk, the escalation. US, because of its history, culture, and the fact that it has done it over and over again over so many years, I believe in some form it is built into this culture that they did not back down away from these kind of interventions, even if it requires them to boots on the ground. China is not emerging to be that kind of power, but again, there are other limitations that the Chinese face with regard to intervening in Taiwan, despite, as you said, that issue being so close to their heart and one of the major red lines for when it comes to Taiwan. So the economy is not doing well. There'll be backlashes. China wants to position itself as a responsible emerging nation state, responsible great global power, which wants to fill in the gaps, the four global deficits that the Chinese keep talking about, where the US has vacated. So this does not align. So there's perception problem, there's image problem as how they look. How they envision themselves. There's capability problem, and there's economic problem. And unlike Venezuela, Taiwan has actually support from US, right? Taiwan has active support, even though it's ambiguous. They have active support from the Americans, unlike the Venezuelans. The Chinese did nothing when the Americans went in Venezuela, right? So that tilts the scales and changes the balance of power, and that becomes an invasion for the Chinese. So a lot of these factors come together in describing and explaining why China behaves in a certain manner and why US behaves in a certain manner.
Amit, I think this is what we need to, be very careful about. That is why we need to be very careful about this perceptions thing, because, you talked about the Venezuelan thing. And I remember when the Venezuelan operation happened, and then only a few weeks after that, the Iranian war happened. I read so many pieces that said, oh, Chinese bluff has been called out. Oh, China is not as powerful as we thought. China didn't come to the aid of two of its closest allies, Venezuela and Iran. And China is much more diminished, has a much more diminished international stature. And just only again a few weeks later in May, we are seeing headlines that suggest, oh, China is far more resolute when compared to Trump's America, is a near peer, is positioning itself as such, is winning the perception battle. So I think the discussion that we have had, I think, adds some nuances to this perception battle, and why we need to look at hard power as well, and the history of how things have unfolded. So thanks, Amit, for engaging in that nuanced bit. I think that would be useful for our listeners. And I'll move towards conclusion now. But before that, maybe a final question or a thought, rather. So, the reason I was looking forward to this trip was last month I had written an opinion piece in which I had essentially argued that Trump's second term in office was breaking a nearly 7-8 year old trend that we saw unfold. I think uh, from around 2017 onwards, wherein the US China tech competition was a very high priority issue for both countries, and especially US, which took a lot of actions, starting from Huawei, then to semiconductors, AI, even connected car technology, so on and so forth. And then we see last year that when Trump comes into power, he does a few things in the first few months, and then he backs down. He lets the chips flow. I think he also does some deal with Xi in Busan, in South Korea, and of course, China also flips the supply chain warfare script onto the US, uses export controls on rare earths and so on and so forth as a bargaining chip. And what we see is the cooling off of the tech competition between both sides, and US not doing as much as it was expected to do in managing the tech competition with China. So the reason I was looking forward to this trip is I thought, okay, this trip will give us an indicator as to whether Trump would try to revive the tech competition bit in some way, maybe intensify it or not, or whether the idea that Trump will let things cool off on the tech competition front will continue for remainder of his term. So I was looking for signs for that, and I think based on what I understand, I didn't see any signs of the tech competition intensifying. Right,
Right.
the Trump would continue to deprioritize the tech bit. That is something that I preliminarily read from the trip, unless of course new details emerge that make me change the understanding I have. So I want to know your views, and you have been following China for many years now very closely, and you've also looked at the tech question very closely. So do you concur with my understanding here, or you think there were some signs that indicated otherwise?
See, I agree with most of what you said. Just on the chronology bit, I don't think Trump has undone 7 to 8 years of consensus. I would say he has undone 3 to 4 years of consensus of Biden administration. So let's go back to 2017 when Trump arrived on scene in 2016. The first thing on agenda, and in 2017 and 18 he started talking about decoupling. So trade was one thing that was high on his agenda. And late 2017 and early 2018, he started talking about the idea of decoupling, right? And therefore, the first round of measures, tariff barriers come in, right? And when there was some sort of agreement between US and China, China said we'll increase our commitment to purchase more from the US and will reduce trade deficit. So larger trade deficit was an issue for Trump. And he started with the idea of decoupling. At that point of time, the idea of decoupling had not been accepted by the community at large, in the Western community, I would say, even in other parts of the world. But as he ended his first term and as COVID struck, and after 2020, there were a series of attempts for the Chinese to weaponize trade. And the world saw two things, right? One, how dependent was the world on Chinese manufacturing capability because of the COVID thing, and how when supplies were choked and they really felt vulnerable because businesses need to diversify because of the dependence on China. And second, it also the greater willingness of the Chinese told you that you need to, some form of remedial measures are needed. So Trump was, proven to an extent, right? Although his motives were very different, but the world quickly realized by 2022 that there needs to be done something on this front, and therefore the idea of then de-risking emerged. And there were again problems and divergences between the businesses' interests and the state interests. In the EU, US, the businesses and states, they had varying ideas of how to deal with the situation. And by 2023, it had become clear that this dependence was going to be an issue and we need de-risking. But starting 2023, it became clear that, it was recognized that trade in itself and trade deficit in itself is not a problem. The problem is vulnerabilities, and you do not want to be vulnerable and be in a position where you can be economically coerced. And therefore, the idea of de-risking emerged from the idea of decoupling. So, and that idea took hold by mid 2023. And at the same time, while this was happening in Europe, under Biden administration, at the center of the trade war, technology, as I said, tech war had, taken stage. So more than trade, technology was an issue that the Americans were more interested in de-risking, or decoupling, I would say, right? So that was the time when they started doing this again. After Trump has come back, the focus has again gone back from tech to trade in the US administration. And I would completely agree with you that this has happened. But at the same time, it does not actually mean that the trade thing has lost. I would say it's not being looked at by the American administration. Why? Because some of these things have shifted away from BIS, which continues to sanction entities, to other agencies, which do not catch that much of limelight. Very recently, there was a piece in Financial Times, which talked about another agency of the US that is looking at sanctioning Chinese service providers on some issue. I don't remember what that was. I think, cellular models. So they are thinking of, because of the dependence, very huge dependence. Even the American market depends on the Chinese for cellular models. Up to 70% market share is with the Chinese, and they are now starting to panic. So, and that particular agency is doing things, working around and looking at things, how they can reduce their dependence on this tech domain. So I think a lot of things are happening. They just are not getting as much limelight because, that kind of creates instability in the relations, and the Americans do not want that at this point of time. I would say you are right in the sense that the focus has shifted from a very narrow approach to de-risking and decoupling with the Chinese. And what Trump has done, or his actions have done, is expand the scope of disagreements and conflict. I would rather have wanted, as you said, this thing to be narrowed down and just be fought on the tech front. But I think the tech front, things are still happening on the tech front. It's just that the Trump administration this time again has broadened the scope to again include other forms of trade.
Thank you so much, Amit. I think with that, we'll bring this episode to conclusion. And I think in this episode, we covered a lot of ground in terms of the background of US-China rivalry, competition, and developments for the last decade or so. And I'm thankful to you, Amit, for setting the context about this trip, in which context this trip took place, why it was significant. You also spoke about the idea of expectations, and really you brought in the prism of, depends on which prism you look it from when it's talk about expectations. Then we covered takeaways and highlights. We covered the Iran question, the Taiwan question, and also the tech one. So I think all in all, thank you so much for all the listeners who joined us. Please let us know your thoughts, your comments. If you have any disagreements with us or any agreement with us, please feel free to write to Takshashila. Thank you, Amit. We'll conclude now.
Thank you so much.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.